All right, we're ready. Hey guys, welcome to the channel. My name is Jay Wilson. Today I'm just doing a little code review for those of you who are dipping your toes into Python, and in particular Python and plus Domo integration. I'm doing this video not because I think I'm some sort of a Python expert, although I have been spending a lot of time working in writing Python scripting for the last year and a half. But I just kind of wanted to introduce you guys to kind of my thought process about how I develop code and deploy code with people that I work with. And maybe this will kind of give you some ideas as you're getting started in Python. Again, if you're like some sort of a crazy expert, you'll probably not pick a lot up here. Anyway, the inspiration of this video came from someone in the community who said, hey, there's this new undocumented API, this Wrangle API, that I came across, and Jay, you might want to know about it and kind of add it to some of the workflows that you're doing. And I said, okay, cool, I'll check it out. But then I noticed as I was kind of looking at kind of this bit of code here, I said, okay, there are some opportunities for improvement that might allow you to scale the code you're writing while reducing duplicate code, and then possibly make it easier for you to make revisions in the future. So again, that's kind of the preamble for why I'm putting this video together. Now, in order for me to even run this bit of code that's been provided, I do need a session token. So I guess I'll kind of introduce you to how I handle authentication in Python up here. So the first thing you're going to need to have is you're going to need to have python.env installed. Python.env allows you to create a file, a .env file that will have your credentials stored. But if you're, for example, backing your stuff up to GitHub, you can say Git, I want you to ignore anything with the .env file, and then you don't accidentally plaster your username and password all over the internet. So if you're not familiar with .env files, if you're not familiar with git ignore, go ahead and Google that. But this gives you a nice, easy way for like handling credentials, sharing code samples, but also making sure you don't accidentally share your password. So first thing you got to do is you got to pip install .env. By the way, if you didn't know, if you just do !, pip install la la la, this will run the task in terminal. So this will, this isn't a Python command. This is actually running in terminal. It's installing python.env. I now have that module available, so I can import .env, and I can say, okay, the path to that env file is .env, and this all runs. Now, one of the things I do like to do when I'm writing code, especially if I have a hard-coded variable, I'll do that in all caps, just so that I know, hey, this is a setting that a user can change. And because it's the path of a file, a lot of times I'll like to test. So I'll say, if not os.path exists, then raise an exception. And I might use an f string, env path does not. Okay, so what this should do is if I, refer to a file that doesn't actually exist, it should throw an error because I raised an exception and it says enva does not. This is a really, little small things like this will make sure that you don't, run your entire block of code and a setting or a file path that you expect to be there doesn't exist. So if you're not familiar with exceptions, I strongly recommend that you get comfortable with exceptions and learn how to use them. You can even get a little fancy with it and create a custom exception. So I could say, hey, I want to make a new exception type. And so that exception type is going to be a class. And I'll say env, I'll call it env path error. It is of type exception, or extends the exception class. And anytime you define a new class, you have to have an init file or an init method. So I'll say init, and the init method will receive self, and maybe it will also receive the expected path. And then I can say, cool, I'm initializing this class. I'm creating an instance of this class. So instead of raising exception, I'm going to raise env path error. And instead of defining the error message, maybe I just want to pass in the path. And then within the initialization, I can say super. And what super does is super refers to the class that my new class is based off of, in this case, exception. And I'll say super init. So what do I want to do here? Then I'll pass in my message. F string, I just deleted it, that was foolish. Path exists, and I can just initialize the exception. This is like crash course flying through, but if you want to learn how to create custom exceptions, I'm sure there's other videos on YouTube, you can watch that slower. So let's see. I've created a new class, and then I'm saying, hey, test if auth path exists, pass in the env path. If it does not exist, raise the exception, and where the path, which is of type string. Here. So now it says env path error as the exception instead of just a generic exception. And it says enva does not exist. Well, obviously, my environment path should be .env. Assuming that this exists, then I will have a variable called env that has the contents of env stored in it. What I do like to do for stuff like this is put it in a nice little wrapper. So maybe I will create a function called get env, where you pass in the path. And as part of that, all I've got to do is test if the path exists, and then I'll just return env values. And so then my function can be get env, pass in env path. I don't want to print that for you, so I'm going to say env is equal to get env path. Boom. Cool. Now I know that works, or I'm relatively confident that works, but just to test it, maybe we want to print one of the values in here is the Domo instance. And so you can guess I have in my .env file, I've declared 3 values, the username, the password, and the Domo instance. So maybe I can also print, yeah, so I know that's working. Cool. So again, this was, again, super crash course on how to use classes to raise custom exception type. I've shown you how you can test for something that has to be true in order for the rest of this whole process to work. And I will raise exceptions if something went wrong. And then, you know, how to write a function. We know how to do that. Okay, cool. So let's get straight into trying to, again, get a session token. In order to get a session token, I have to have a function that handles authentication. In the Postman documentation, I can link that below. I've written functions about how to get an authentication token using your username and password. So I've just written a function called get auth token. It will receive a username, password, and instance. And then I'll talk about this in a moment. But basically what we'll have it do is we'll say, here's the URL I want you to hit. These are the headers that we need to pass. This is the body of the request. We need to pass in the Domo username and password, and then we'll get the response. Okay. So just a couple of things, right? The first half of this should all be pretty straightforward. One of the things I do like to do is when I'm putting a string of functions together. Sometimes I don't know where things break. Sometimes I don't, I make the wrong assumptions. And so if I'm hitting an API, I like to have a Boolean, so you can see it's type bool, and I could say something like if debug API, what I want you to do is I want you to print the URL and print the body. And I guess I could do the headers, but there's nothing dynamic about the headers, so I won't add that to this print function here. And what that should allow me to do is, and this is my test function below, so I'll say debug API is equal to false. If I say debug API is equal to false, there is no print, it just returns the response. But if I set it to true, it will, ooh, maybe I should pprint. Import pprint. Okay, that's not how you do it. Cool. So now if I pass debug API is equal to true, it will give me a pretty print. And then sometimes I'll see, oh, Jay, just kidding, you made a mistake in how you configured your body, or maybe there's a typo in your URL, and you'll be able to see that when I debug API. Let me set this to false, because that's behaving as I want it to. What I might also do is I might extend my function and add a return raw option. Why would I do that? Well, when I successfully send, or when I successfully get an access token back from Domo, the only part of the response that I want is the access token. The rest of it is just garbage. And so maybe I will create an option for giving me the entire response or just the part I want. I know that doesn't make quite sense yet, so let me demonstrate that. What I'll do here is I'm going to pass in the real username, so I'm going to use that .env object, pass in my Domo username, use that env object, pass in my Domo password. Bug API is false, and is that going to print my password in clear text? I don't think it will. Okay, so if I run this, okay, cool. So I got a successful response. Again, the only part about this that I care about is that session token, and the rest of this I don't care about. And so what you would typically do is in your function, you would say, okay, data is equal to res.json, and the part that I want to return is data dot, oops, sorry, not dot, but session token. And maybe I want to add an assertion here. So maybe I want to, let's see, if not data.get session token, then maybe I will raise exception no session token return. And we know better than that. So instead of writing it that way, maybe we'll create a new class, get auth token, error exception, and it is based off of the exception class. Say define init. So what happens when I initialize this function? I have to pass in self, and maybe I'll pass in the Domo instance and the Domo username, and I'll say my message is equal to fstring unable to retrieve unaccess token for Domo username at Now, there's a couple reasons why I might be unable to get an access token. Maybe I have a bad username and password. Maybe I have an invalid Domo instance. I could use all sorts of, I was going to say case statements, but I could use like if statements to define a bunch of different auth token error types and raise different error types depending on the response from the API. That's my message. And just to finish this off, I need to super. So I need to initialize the parent, which is the exception class, and just pass in the message. I believe that is correct. So now, in order to raise this error type, I just have to pass in the Domo instance and Domo username. So in here, I will just pass in instance. Okay, so let's see if that works. Cool. And I have a valid session returned. But like I said, for debugging, sometimes it's nice to get the raw body back. So I have a Boolean here, returned raw, type bool is false. And what I'll do is, before I do any kind of data processing, I might say, if return raw, then return the data. I don't really care about the, well, actually I might care about the entire response. So if return raw, return the response. Otherwise, we do this data processing step where the end goal is to get the session token. So again, what does that look like? By default, if I don't do anything, it behaves like normal, but if I pass in return raw equal to true, then I get the whole response back, and then I can parse the response, get the status code, or look at the entire JSON, right? I can do stuff with the entire response if I wanted that. Let me comment that out. And because I don't have return raw is equal to true, I now have a session. Cool. That was a lot of work just to finally get to looking at this person's code. So what did they do? They are working on updating a column description by hitting this dataset ID. I love the use of the F string. If you're not familiar with that, what it allows you to do is embed variables, right, or concatenate, I guess, is the closest equivalent, into a string, but it's just a really clean way of putting that all together. So that's pretty cool. What I don't love, and this is actually the reason why I put this video together, is that here, this person wrote headers, na 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 na. And the reason why I don't like this is because every Domo function, or every function that we hit Domo with, is going to have the same xDomo authentication, pass in a session token. Well, what happens in 2 weeks when this person's like, oh, instead of using full authentication, this username and password authentication, what if they wanted to use the access token authentication? Well, that actually uses a different header type. And so now what has happened to you is you're like in this position where now you have to refactor all of your code in order to extend functionality. Guess who's done that before, and it sucks. So what if instead of having all of this code duplicated in each Domo function, what if I had another function called getData or something like that, where I pass in, solve the what different authentication methods problem right now, but I'll just pass in the, yeah, you'll pass in the session token, you'll pass in the URL that you want to hit, you'll pass in the body if applicable. So let's assume this is a dictionary of type none. This is going to be a string. This is also going to be a string. And maybe you pass in additional headers if applicable. Additional headers, which is a dictionary of type. Okay. So that's going to be the start of my get data function. And what is the get data function's job? It just gets. Okay, that's the job of this function. And what can I move up there? Well, I can move headers into get data because all get data functions will have the same type and accept. Now that's a lie because I might sometimes have different APIs that use a different set of headers. So maybe I'll say, well, if you choose to pass in additional headers, I'll just destructure them into the headers object. And if the content type happens to be application text, this would be overwritten by this headers.update command. I think that's how you write it. I think that's the syntax for destructure. What else can I do? I'm going to use this. I'm going to move the response up here. And let me just organize this a little bit so you can read it. Debug API. And we'll add. Nope, we're always going to return raw, so I don't need to add that. But what I might want to add is the method. Yes. What is the method? Default will be a GET request. Cool. Solve real quick so this looks a little cleaner. Okay. So to call. Oh, this is just a method. Okay, so I can do method equals method, URL equals URL. Do how do you send JSON? Okay, and JSON equals body. So most of the Domo requests are going to be sending JSON back and forth. You don't send a lot of just straight text. And yes, and then we're going to return response. Cool. So what does that mean? What that means is that every function that I write from now until the end of time to hit Domo, I can just use the get data function over and over and over again, and I don't have to rewrite Domo authentication, na. What's really great about that is someday I might say, hey, I want to be able to run my code asynchronously. I can't use the requests method anymore. So maybe I'll have to just replace this chunk of text with a different library that will maybe run concurrently and be more performant. But what that allows me to do is just change one block of code instead of 500. So again, we're just trying to write a little bit more efficient code here. Okay, so then how do I work that in over? Oh, did I add debug API? I didn't. So again, if debug API, let me just copy paste this because I'm lazy. And so print the URL, print the body, and now it might be important to print the headers. Right, because I don't know what's going to happen after destructuring. I should also say if additional headers, then. Cool. So I would argue update column description is actually two functions running at the same time. So one function is just going to get, I messed it up, but one function is just going to get the schema, and the other function is going to handle the post request. So I'm actually going to split this into two functions. So I'm going to say def get dataset wrangle, because I'm not 100% positive it should be called schema. And what will I pass into get dataset wrangle? I'll pass in the session token. So that's my auth method. I'll pass in the dataset ID. Yep, and I think that's it. So then what I'll do is I will call response equals get data, and then what do I pass into get data? I pass in these arguments. So session token will be equal to session token, and I need to construct the URL. Okay, I need to pass in the Domo instance. Okay. So now I have my URL. Method is going to be a get. There's no body because it's just a get. There's no additional headers. And again, to make this testable, I'll pass in debug API as type bool equals false by default. Cool. What I like about this is now my code is testable without, running quote unquote all the code. So now I can test and see what this does. So get data is up there. Let me move this into its own code block. Need a data set ID. Do I have Domo Dojo open? Get any old data set ID. We're doing today. Nice. Okay, so do my test data set ID today is going to be that, and let's see what happens when we call get. That's supposed to say wrangle. So I'll pass in the session token, which I've pulled earlier. The Domo instance is going to come from the .env file. And the dataset ID. Let's leave the debug as false for now, so let's see if this runs. Let's cell, and then let's look at this error. URL is equal to, oh, because I need a comma. Name error. Get data is not defined because I didn't run this yet. Turn? Nope. Oh, 400 error. Hmm. That's interesting. Data's not found. Where we debug API, right? Is this a real, what does it say? Domo community, domo.com, API v1 query, data sources, wrangle. Well, do I not know how? Nope, that's real. And if I copy this, I'm using my credentials, but I think I own it. Also, I'm an admin. So this has 0 rows and columns. Okay, this is a data set that has an index. That might be why it doesn't work. Let me grab a different data set by me. Ending page QA, why not? Okay, different data set ID. Does this one actually have columns and rows? Yes, so it's indexed, so now it should work. I lied. Aha. Okay, so it is working as expected, so let me turn this debug all off. Okay, and so what do I get? I get an object containing columns with an array of columns. Is that it? Yeah. Interesting. Okay, so I think for get dataset wrangle, I'm going to just return the list of columns. So to give us the option again, I'll add in my return raw. So we'll say if return raw, then return res.json. And we'll say if not res.status code equals 200. Wait. Do I want that? Okay. So I think there's two things to consider, right? There's two problems. We need to consider what happens if data set not found, and then what happens if invalid authentication, right? Those are authentication. Those are my two problems. And I shouldn't handle invalid authentication in get dataset wrangle because invalid authentication could happen anywhere. Arguably, I should build logic for handling authentication in my get auth token. So I'm going to just stub out in here that I need to handle this somehow. In get data, I might want to stub out and handle what if not a 200 response? What happens if I don't get a valid response from the server for whatever reason? And I guess I could handle that here in get data, or I can handle that in the function itself. Because this is what kind of error did we get when we didn't get, okay. So here I got a 404 error because the was not found. I would argue that is a problem with the wrangle data function, not a problem with get data. So maybe I should just build some kind of logic for that 204 in here sometime. Not handle the 200 response in the get data. Okay, that's fine. So, all right, I know I need to handle what if I don't get a 200 status code eventually. But so let's say if not res.status code equals 200. So if that doesn't happen, then I'm going to raise exception not 200. And I would obviously do something a little cleaner someday. But otherwise, I got a 200 response, which means I'm good. And so if I'm good and I click return raw, then I want to return res.json. But usually I just want the data that I care about, which is oof, Mr. Wilson. Data is equal to res.json, and then I want to return data.columns, because that's the only part I care about. So let's run that. Erase my exception. Oh no, what was the last character? B. Okay, and so now I just get the columns that I care about. very cool. Okay. So now I can actually get into here and handle some wrangling stuff. Because what did we do with wrangling? We said for key in response.columns. And so instead of doing it that way, I'll say, I'm just going to call get dataset wrangle. And then I just have to pass in the appropriate session token, dataset ID. So let me add debug. Okay, so now we're going to map over the column list. And instead of calling it key, I'm just going to be descriptive about it and say it's a column object. Find the attribute that we want to match. And then once found, update that JSON and post it with the entire JSON response. Okay, got it. So we're going to send the entire list of columns back up to Wrangle and say, hey, this is the new spelling. So for column and column list, sorry, I'm trying to keep my eyes on stuff that I'm supposed to be. So key is now the column object. And we're saying if the value, so if we're looking at the name attribute, I want to change the attribute to the new incoming value. Just to be a little clear about this, I'm going to call this new value. Yeah. I see what you did here. I think this is a little bit of a complicated way of writing this. So I'm going to say, when I get to the column object, I'm just going to update column object dot update the attribute called. And I'm going to set name equal to the new value. And I don't need that iterator. All right, let's see what that looks like. So to test this, instead of actually running this post request, I'm just going to return this result. I'm not a big fan of this for loop. Do I need it though? I think I made a mess. If the name is equal to column name, then set attribute new value. Oh, okay. So no, you did make a mess. For column object in column list, so what if we rewrote this as if column object dot name column. Then we're going to alter the column attribute. So we're going to say column object dot update. This is the part that I messed up. I should have said the attribute that we want to modify is going to get set to the new value. Okay, that's correct, right? Because I guess there's multiple attributes coming back from. Is that true? Yeah, there's multiple attributes coming back. So like description, I could change the tags, I could set visible to true or false. I could set a variety of attributes, but I only want to set the attribute for the column whose name I then pass. Okay. And one of the interesting quirks about Python in this context is, right, okay, column list is going to be a bit of space set aside in the universe that has this list of columns. And I'm going to map over each of the objects in column list. And I'm actually going to update the value in column object. So column list should change from one value to the original value to the new value. Let me see if I can prove that. So let's say can I prove that? Let's say match column is equal to next column object for column object in column list if column object dot name is equal to column name. Okay. So what this should do is it should say search through each column object in column list. If the column is that how you spell column? Yeah. If the column name is equal to this column name, then I want to save that as match column, and we're just going to print it. And so what that should do is that should print the state of match column before I make the update. And so if I then print column again, please don't make a liar out of me, but I believe that will have reflect the updated value. All right, let's see if I know what I'm talking about. I probably don't. So, what do we need to pass in? For my test, we know that there's a column called logo. Okay. And the attribute that we're going to change is the description. Let's just clean this up real quick. Spelling error. This needs to be. Are you unhappy about? Because I don't want to define this, I just want to run it. Is not defined. Who's calling Domo instance? Are you gonna? Missing Domo instance. I just passed it. Get dataset wrangle. Get dataset wrangle also needs Domo instance. Yeah, so in the library that I've written that handles authentication, one of the things that I do is I create a class that associates the session token with the Domo instance, so I don't have to pass them as separate arguments. Obviously, this code sample doesn't include that, but that's just something we could think about for one day. Let's see, stop iteration. So it's saying that it could not find a case where the column name was equal to the column name. That's interesting because the column on this data set, there definitely is a column name called logo. So spell name, lowercase, if that's what we passed in, and we're passing. Okay. So what do we get? An error. New value is not defined. So, perfect. Okay, here we go. So this was the original version here. So here's logo. The description was blank. After we ran through our code, it says, oh, hey, just kidding. I want you to set the new value to hello world. This, again, is one of those weird quirks about just kind of how memory and objects work in Python. So what am I supposed to be looking at? So here, right, we said column list is equal to the result of get dataset wrangle. Again, column list is a list of objects. And then the objects kind of, you can update those objects. And so what we did here is we said, hey, update this column object with the new attribute value. And that's still getting stored in column list. In the original version of this, they used like an iterator and like really relatively complex syntax for updating the column object value. But now we can see in our code here that just kidding, I can just take this stored column list value, push this back up to this API, and well, I think it'll work. But we're not going to do that. I always have to make things a little bit complicated. So here we have an API for get dataset wrangle. We're going to make one more method, one more function for post. So I'll say update, and we'll pass in the same stuff, only this time we also have to pass in the body, or let's call it column ls, and it's going to be a list of objects, a list of dictionaries rather. Okay. I need a comment. Let's format our cell. Na. This is, a lot of this is going to be similar, but this time it's going to be a post method, and we're going to pass in JSON equals, but it's not. It's going to be a dictionary containing columns and then the column object. That's not how you spell it. You spell it like that. Just so that it's a little bit easier to debug, I'm going to say body equals, and then if debug API, then we're going to print all of the things. No, lies. We'll just pass that into get data, and then get data will handle the printing if it goes sideways. I think. Okay, so this is a GET request. So for now, I actually don't know what the response is going to be. So I'm going to just return the entire response. We're not going to test it here. Now, we're going to create dataset wrangle, pass in all of the things. Thing now, ls. So I got a 200 response back from update dataset wrangle. And here for sure, right? Here for sure, I should do something if I don't get a 200 response. Ideally, I think I should not return the entire res response. I'll just return res.json. Doubling back on myself. What does that give us? So it gives us a list of columns. Oh. Update dataset wrangle. Okay, here's the deal. When you set a update command, I could arguably send back the entire column list, right? And we can see here when I run update column description, the response is whatever I'm getting back from update dataset wrangle, which at the moment is a JSON of all of the columns. I could do that, but I don't want to. And the reason why I don't is I don't care what the API thinks the column list should or should not be. I need a true or false. I need to know, did this work or not? So instead of returning raw, I'm going to return true. And if res.status code does not equal 200, I'm going to raise an exception, but I also would think about returning false, right? Because, well, I mean, this code actually won't work. You can't raise an exception and return a false. But I need to know that it did not run. So, cool. I will return raw to get the original response if I want it. I have that as an option, but I just need that Boolean true or false to let me know, hey, I successfully updated the column description. And so now my response to update column description is true because it did actually update the column description. Yep. And I know that's true because I have the original value, column printing. Okay, so I have that. I guess I could just check in the API and see, did it actually, so for the description, did this work? It says, hey, yeah, I successfully updated your schema. If I go to the data tab, hop over to the descriptions under the logo, it says hello, did this work? So it's behaving as I expected to. Wow, holy cow, we covered a whole ton of stuff. So let me see if I can't give you the cliff notes, because how long is this video? Thanks, an hour. Okay, what kind of things did we talk about? We talked about using your .env file, Python to handle storing creds in a second file, .env file, so that you don't actually share your creds with the universe. Pretty important. We looked at using a custom exception class learned how to define a class that would allow you to throw custom errors, which will give you more descriptive errors and help you write code where you can say, hey, if this thing is not true, throw this type of error. And if this thing is not true, throw the other type of error. The last thing you want to do is have your code run that doesn't know what good looks like, and then all of a sudden you're like, ooh, I'm really having difficulty debugging this wall of code because I didn't throw any errors or build in any error handling. Trust me, spend time on that one. Another thing we looked at was using the os.path.exists function to test if a path exists, but also we use this as a method of demonstrating how to raise custom error types with parameters instead of manually typing out the message every time. I walked through how I handle building getting auth tokens. Most of this was around compartmentalizing your code so that if you need to change code, you can. And some of the tricks that we learned in this function was to build or add in that debug API property so that I can print what is the URL, what is the body, what are the headers that I'm sending, just in case stuff randomly stops working. We looked at using return raw. Return raw will say return the entire response or return the response.json, or just return the thing that I actually care about, which in the case of this function is the session token itself, not the entire response body. We saw that it might be interesting to have a get data function that is separate from the logic of the root or the API that I'm hitting. And so we wrote the get data function to allow me to have recyclable code. One day you're going to want to use a different library than requests. And when that day comes, it's going to be super easy to update your code base because all you have to change is this one function instead of changing 15 or 16 of the same thing multiple times. And I hate writing things multiple times. We looked at using destructuring to destructure additional headers onto your header object. I think this might be pseudocode. It might be only 1 star, so you might have to Google this to get the exactly right syntax. But destructuring, if you haven't looked at it yet, is something you definitely want to know more about. We looked at splitting getting something from doing an action, so getting versus posting. And so we wrote that function get dataset wrangle, which was pretty straightforward. One of the slight changes we made, though, is we said, hey, I don't actually care about the entire JSON response. I only care about the columns property. So I can pick and choose what to return. But again, if I have that return raw flag, I can choose to return the entire response or not. Again, just ways to make our code a little bit more debuggable. In the actual update function, we took a look at using list comprehension, and we said, hey, list comprehensions will actually allow us to update the object in place if I understand a little bit better how kind of objects are stored in Domo. And this takes a lot, or sorry, not Domo, but Python. This takes a lot of Googling. It is pretty confusing. But at the end of the day, I was able to do an update in place during my list comprehension, which I thought was pretty slick. Yep. And then we run our update function, and there's our test. It's rewritten, it's beautiful, and what I really appreciate about this, this is why we split this into 3 different functions, is each chunk of it is testable. I can test the result of get dataset wrangle. I can test the result of update dataset wrangle without actually applying it to real code. And I think that's really important because the last thing you want to do is, fall off the face of the planet. Somebody else has to take over your code and they're like, oof, I can't debug this. I can't work through this piece by piece at a time. I don't know what the response of get dataset wrangle will be. So I hope you found this video interesting and useful. I know it was a bit of a long one, but go forth, do great things. Hit me up if you have any questions.